Hey guys, it's Kat again with another ZBrush tutorial. So what we're working on today is something that I like to call my jewelry essentials. So these would be pieces and parts or components that you can reuse in different designs. So this is a little bezel setting, and we can save this subtool and then bring it into other projects. I'll show you an example in just a moment. If we turn off the stone here, you can see that this is essentially a ring. And the ring has a little shelf in it where the stone sits. The other interesting thing about this is its actual size. So this particular piece, if I were to go in and measure, let me see if it'll work here. I'll switch to the move mode and grab a transpose line. If I click and drag on the side, and go side to side here, you can see, for example, that this one is about 3.34 units. This is a little bit big, but it would accommodate a 3mm stone. So that's just an example. But let's take a look at what we could add this to that might make it a pretty design. So I've got, for example, a ring that I was just playing around with. Won't save changes on this one. And you can see there's some little curves on there that are a little strange. But anyway, so this is one of the signet rings. And I have another tutorial I'm working on for the signet ring. But it's hollow on the back, and it has a bezel and a flower. So this little bezel component is something that I had saved, and I just brought it in and added it to my project. And we'll actually work on a flower signet ring later, but for right now, let's go ahead and do just the bezel. So with that, let's get started. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is to use the simple brush over here under the tool palette. So we'll click on Simple Brush. I'm going to switch, because I was already working on something, and then do a Command-N or Control-N to get a blank stage. I'll click on Simple Brush and then choose Sphere 3D. We'll then click and drag on the canvas like this and immediately press the T key, which will switch us to an editing mode. Make sure that if you're working, perspective is turned off. You can toggle that on and off with the P key. But the first step in this is to create a cabochon, which is a small rounded stone. And I'll go ahead and switch materials while we're at it. I'll use this MAH Dirty Blue, which is kind of a standard one that jewelry artists are using right now. So we'll just use that. Now, before I do anything else, I need to convert this to something that's editable. So up on the right-hand side under Tool is a button, Make Polymesh 3D. Go ahead and click that button. All of a sudden, a lot of other things will appear here on the right-hand side. If you want to check and make sure that this has been applied correctly, you could also, in this vertical bar, click on Polyframe. It is 5 up from the bottom. If you click on that, you'll see that your sphere actually turns a color, and the underlying mesh is displayed. And we'll be turning this on and off throughout the project so we can see what the underlying mesh looks like. So let's turn that off. But now we know that our Polymesh 3D is ready to edit. So we'll switch to the move mode up here, or just press W to switch modes. And we want to make sure that the Gizmo 3D is turned on. You can toggle that on and off with a Y. The gizmo is displayed here in the middle, but we want to clip the bottom of this sphere off and also close it off at the same time. So whenever you're working in ZBrush, there is a function called the clip curve or a clip tool, which will do that. Now, if I hover over this little rectangle, you'll see down below, it says Scale Y Control to Clip. So anytime you're working in ZBrush, if you see that where it says Control, if you're on a Mac, you're going to be using the Command key. So it's Control on a PC, Command on a Mac. So press down the key that you're using, so Command or Control, click on this rectangle, and then click and drag up, which will eliminate that bottom. We're also using that middle bar, that middle line right there in the gizmo, as an indicator for the halfway mark on our cabochon. So let's squash it a little bit. This is a little bit of a high dome. So if we click on that rectangle and squash it, maybe to about 0.8, That's probably a pretty accurate representation of a cabochon. Now, if I go over here to the right-hand side and look for geometry and click on that palette and scroll to the bottom, a couple up from the bottom is the size subpalette. In this case, it shows us that this object is an XYZ size of 2, which means that the largest side, whatever the largest dimension is 2. In this case, if we look below that, the X and Z axis are 2, which would make sense since it's a circle. We want to switch that to 5. So click on that field, type 5, and hit enter. The size, the Y size, is this top to bottom size. And if you're using a particular stone, you could adjust these. So if it's actually 5.1, or maybe 2.2 millimeters high, you can switch these numbers to make it accurately reflect your stone. So what do these numbers mean? These numbers, when I'm working in ZBrush, are the millimeters of size that I'm working with. So as of now, this stone has been resized to approximate a 5 millimeter stone. And I do know that with my printer, I get pretty darn close to that. So it might require a little back and forth in the beginning until you figure out exactly what your calibration is. But on mine, this is pretty accurate. I'm using a Formlabs Form 2. So there's our stone. So the very next step is to switch to the subtool palette, and we need to bring in the ring. So use the append function, which is down below. Go to the side menu and bring in a ring 3D. Now switch to the ring 3D subtool, but we don't see it. It's not visible here within our model. If you turn on transparency, which is the button fourth from the bottom, click on transparency, you'll see that the ring is inside the cabochon and it's also smaller. Well, so let's say that we want to increase the size here. I still have my gizmo turned on, so I can click on this square here and try and increase the size, and it's not working. It usually does work, so something's not quite right. If yours is working, go ahead and click and drag. But if it's not, don't worry about it. Let's switch over to the Deformation palette. Scroll to the top of that, come down about the middle, and look for size. You can then increase the size of your piece like this. Let's move that up above the stone. So I'm just using this arrow here to move it in place. So there we go. Now if you click and drag, what I'm doing is I'm using the Shift key to snap to a side view or to a top view or a bottom view. Take notice though that I can't really see the edge of the stone here because of the positioning, but if I go to the bottom, it's now dark. And what I'm looking for is the stone come about halfway on the diameter, I guess, of that ring. So I can either use the size command, or if I'm able to, oh, this one's working now, I can increase the size by using the gizmo. And I want this to actually be a little bit less on this dark side, a little bit more over here. So now that we've increased the size, we can then go to the side like this and use this rectangle again to stretch this. And we're going to stretch it about 1.5 on the vertical axis, something like that. So we sort of have a tall donut. But it's very faceted. So if you look at your little donut right now, the donut is not very pretty. It's not something we would want to print and put in a nice piece of jewelry. So let's switch back over to the geometry palette, and we're going to use a quick trick that I use a lot to fix this problem. So if I divide, use the divide command and divide once and then divide twice, my ring is now a lot smoother. However, ZBrush maintains all of those subdivisions. So you'll see a little slider up here. And if you click and drag that to the middle, you can see the faceting comes back, and down to the bottom, there's our original ring. So slide this all the way to the right, and a button will appear right under it that shows Del Lower, which is delete lower. Go ahead and click that because we don't need all of those layers of coarseness, I guess. We want to get rid of those. If we were to turn our polyframe on, So the fifth button up from the bottom, turn that on now. You can take a look at that underlying mesh. And it's fine, but it's not super fine. Like we wouldn't want to start sculpting on that. But it's smooth enough that visually this looks just fine. Let's go ahead and DynaMesh this. So part of the operation we're going to be doing is using something called DynaMesh Boolean operations, and it's a subtract. So we'll be bringing in a cylinder and cutting into this ring. But before we do that, we have to convert this particular ring to a DynaMesh object. Under the geometry palette, we're looking for the DynaMesh tab right here. So click on that. And you can see that there's a DynaMesh button, but it's not highlighted. That tells us that this ring is not a DynaMesh object. How do we convert it, and what resolution do we use? If you watch a lot of videos on YouTube, they will tell you, they might say put 512 in this box right here. We don't want to go that high because the higher the resolution, the slower your computer performs and the higher the number of active points. A lot of my strategy with ZBrush is to use the lowest possible resolution so the computer is a lot more responsive and we don't have to wait for operations. So I'll show you how I determine what resolution to use. Under the DynaMesh area, you see 128. Let's go all out. Let's move this slider all the way to the bottom, which is an 8. And now click the DynaMesh button and see what happens. This ring now is very coarse and it has a mesh that's really ugly. And if you want to see this, go over here to the polyframe and turn that on and you can see that underlying mesh. It's just not smooth and it's not pretty. So let's undo. So Command Z or Control Z. And so you can see the difference between the mesh that we had and we're back to the original. So let's go back to resolution and let's type in something like 32 and hit enter. And let's DynaMesh that. You could see when I DynaMeshed that I got a little bit of faceting, but let's turn on the polyframe. And so we can see the underlying mesh and it's finer, but it's still not pretty. Let's turn off the mesh and undo again. If we use the slider, it will sometimes not let us hit all of these resolutions. So let's type in something like 48. And these are always divisible by 4. So if you ever type in something like 50 and it changes, that's because it wants a multiple of 4. So we got 48 and let's click DynaMesh. And I saw no difference almost between my mesh and then the DynaMesh version. So let's look at the polyframe. You can see it's a little bit finer. And turn that off. And I see just a little bit of faceting. So let's go one more time. I'm going to bump this up to 56 and hit enter. Now I'll DynaMesh. And that looks good. I saw pretty much no change there. So this is effectively the best mesh that I could use for this particular operation. The other thing you might notice, and I'll undo real fast, don't follow along, but I'll undo and look up here at the number of active points. So when I had my original mesh, it's nice and smooth, was 32,000, almost 33,000 points. When I change my resolution to 56 and hit enter and DynaMesh, that jumps up to 51. So it's still a low amount with a good resolution, so I'm happy with that. So just pay attention to that and you might have to test. So another concept to keep in mind, and this will become clearer as we go on, but when you're working in DynaMesh, the resolution is lower the larger your object. When we started out with the original size, which was 2 by 2 by 2, we might be using a resolution that was 128. But as we increase the size of this, I can bump this down and use a much lower resolution. We'll explore that more, but for right now, just understand, if you have a very small object, that resolution will be higher. But we're working in actual size, so generally your resolution is going to be maybe no higher than 256. So now that our object is a DynaMesh, we have a cabochon, it's time to go add the cutter. Under the subtool palette, we'll append a cylinder 3D. You'll see that it pops up down here at the bottom, so we need to make that active. We could go to our subtool palette and select it, or there's a shortcut, which is to hold down Option or Alt and click on the object. That is a shortcut for making it the active object. Now I need to increase the size of the cylinder. Let's go look at the geometry palette and the size. So remember what I said, that all of these objects come in 2 by 2 by 2. In theory, I need to have this a little bit larger than the stone. So on this XYZ size, I'm first going to change the overall size, and you'll see that it disappeared because I'm using a Wacom pad. Whenever I click here, it makes it really small and I have to enter a number. But I know, for example, that on my printer, if I add about 0.15 to the size, like that, so I have 5.15, that will be big enough to give my stone a little clearance. I have minimal cleanup, if any. Here is that cylinder. And we're going to be cutting into the ring. But let's look real quickly and see if we can see the cabochon and if there's any clearance. And I can see right here, there's a little clearance. So that looks pretty good. Let's move it up into position with the green arrow. Again, I'm in the move mode and I have the gizmo turned on. I'll move this up into position about halfway up on the ring. Let's see about here at the halfway mark. Now let's see if I can tell where my objects are. And I can't, it's not real easy to see. But from the bottom I can tell. This blue right here, that blue is my cylinder. This little white line here is the outline of my stone. That gives me a little clearance, and that looks pretty good. Notice that there's some faceting on this cylinder, and we need to get rid of that. Remember how we did that on the ring and actually just on the ring at this point. The quick and easy way to fix this is we want to divide and then delete the bottom divisions. We can go to the geometry palette and we can use the divide command, or we can use a key command. On a Mac, it's Command D, and on a PC, it's Control D. We'll divide twice, then you can go to the geometry palette and delete lower, just like that. And this is nice and smooth. It's good enough for what we're working on. But notice that the bottom is rounded now, so we need to clean that up. And to do that, we can use that same clip function that we did before. You'll hold down Command or Control, whether you're on a Mac or PC, and then click on this rectangle, click and drag. If it does that, I rotate it. I'll just undo, hold Command or Control, click and drag, and I'm just dragging up until I have a nice sharp edge on that cylinder. Once I've done that, I need to move it back into position using the gizmo, and that looks good. But that will give me a nice sharp edge. Now we are ready to subtract. So I'll switch to the subtool palette, and I need to scroll all the way up to be able to see all my objects. If I want, I can turn off my cabochon for now. We don't need it anymore, or at least until later. Here we go. This little guy right here is our cutter, so why don't we rename it? Click on that layer to make it active, click rename, and let's type cutter and hit enter. The ring is going to become the bezel, so let's rename that and call it bezel. Just like that. Now it's very important to have the bezel up above the cutter. Make sure that the bezel is above. If it's not, you can use these arrows to move it up and down. My bezel is above the cutter. We also know that this bezel is a DynaMesh, and I'll also show you, I have a customized interface. In my interface, I put the DynaMesh button down here, so I can at a glance choose this bezel and know that it's a DynaMesh. But since the operation we're doing is a DynaMesh subtract, we need to make sure that the object that you're subtracting from is a DynaMesh. The other one, it doesn't matter. Now on the cutter, we need to click this third icon. There's an arrow, kind of a MasterCard symbol, and then a moon. You want to click that moon because that's the subtract function. Now, making sure that the bezel is selected, it has a little bit lighter background, we're looking for the merge function down here in the subtool palette. So merge, and I'm using merge down. Click Always OK, and something happens that will throw you off a little bit. When I first started using ZBrush and I wasn't really all that familiar with DynaMesh Booleans, I would think I did something wrong. And the answer is you didn't. Once you do this, you need to re-dynamesh the object to make the subtraction happen. You can either do that by going to the Geometry palette, going to the DynaMesh subpalette and clicking DynaMesh twice. Or you can hold down Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and just draw a box on the background. When you do that, it forces ZBrush to do a remesh, and our resulting piece is our bezel. A couple things we'll notice. There is a little tiny bit of artifacting in here, and that has to do with the resolution of our DynaMesh. So before, if we had bumped it up a little bit, maybe to like 80, or 64, I think 64 is divisible. Anyway, if you bump that up in resolution, you won't notice that as much. Or we can simply go to the Deformation palette and then use Polish, just like 1 or 2. Let's try 1. And you can see that that smooths it sufficiently. I also might want to clean up that top edge. I could use that same clip operation with Command or Control and clip the top. Couldn't really see it, so you can also do that at an angle. So hold down Command or Control and then click and drag. So see how I'm modifying that? And I'm just basically polishing off that top edge. Something like that. One last thing to keep in mind when you're making your bezel like this is remember that this is a 5mm bezel. It's extremely small. Any of that artifacting that you see right now, if it's a little bit, you're not going to notice that once it's printed, at least not on these types of settings. All right, so we are done with actually making our bezel. So how do we make this look good for, say, like rendering with a ring? Switch to the Subtool palette. And we have our stone. Let's turn the visibility back on with our stone. And let's move it up into position. So how do we know when it's in the right position, since we can't see inside? Well, let's switch to the stone and use the move mode and move this up. We knew it was about halfway. But once the stone is in the setting, we can see that there's a gap. And if you want at this point, turn off transparency so you can get a better idea. Now here's the trick on this though. We want to increase the size of our stone so it looks correct, but we do not want to increase the size of our bezel because the bezel is the correct size for our setting. How do we know? We can measure it. So switch back to the bezel and let's switch to, let's see, we're in the move mode. Let's turn off the gizmo and use this transpose line. You can see that as I'm over on this edge with my cursor, it's trying to snap. So all we do is we'll click, oops, didn't want to do that. And if it does something funky, you can always click somewhere and just draw so you can start again, but I'm hovering, I'll click and drag using the Shift key over to this other edge until it snaps. And you can see up here it says 5.08. And it's pretty close, and I know that my measurements were right when I was building it. If I needed to, I could increase the size a bit, but I know that this one's correct. The bezel is the right size. The stone is the only thing that we can touch at this point. So I'll switch back to the gizmo, and it is centered here. Let me increase its size. So I'm turning to a side view and using this little square to increase its size, and then move it up into place. What's nice about the gizmo too is you can be at an angle and you know that this is the y-axis. So that makes things really nice. So there we have a stone in the bezel. And this is just for mocking it up. But once you're ready to print, you'll turn off that stone or get rid of it. And what you're left with is the accurately printing bezel. So let's assign a color to this while we're at it. First, let's select the stone, switch to the draw mode, and we need to turn on the material channel, which is this M up here. Now over on the material picker, you can find a stone that you like. And I tend to like something like blue glass, which I downloaded from Pixelogic's site. Once the whole thing turns blue, go up here to the color palette or color menu and choose fill object. If you look over here in the subtool palette, you'll see that the bezel is still, over here at least, it's still a whitish color. So now I can switch to the bezel, go to the material picker and choose a metal. And then for good measure, let's just go to the color menu and choose fill object. So there's one last thing here. I see some faceting in the stone. So let's fix that. You already know how to do this. It's easy. We're going to divide. So remember there's a shortcut. So you can use Command D or Control D, and that smooths it out. We don't need lower subdivisions, so just go to the geometry palette and let's delete lower, and there's our stone. With that, there is our bezel setting. Very last step, I swear this time, is we need to do a save as. And we're going to save this subtool. Maybe create a folder, and mine will take a minute. There we go. So I keep a folder for subtools. That'll work just fine. And I can just rename this bezel setting tutorial. Or even better yet, I could say this is a bezel setting for 5mm. And there are some other projects, we'll do one later, but you could resize this and then have multiple bezels and then save that. So if you ever want to use a different size bezel, all you have to do is just kind of bring it in and all of the bezels are available. So that is this part of the tutorial, and keep an eye out because the next one I'll do is a bezel with ZModeler. Okay, so you only thought that this tutorial was done, but guess what? There's more. So after I finished editing this, I realized that there was something missing from the tutorial, which was we never did cut it in half and measure the thickness. First of all, what we want to do is we want to use a tool called Select Rect. You get to that by holding on a Mac, Command and Shift, or on a PC, Control Shift. Hold down those two keys, and up in the brush area, the Select Rect should be loaded. If you've been working in other things on ZBrush, you may have changed that. There are other things like Clip Curve, which do the same thing like the clip with the gizmo that we did before, but Select Rect will allow us to basically section this. Switch to a side view and hold the Shift key, so it looks like this, and make sure that the bezel is selected. Hold down Command and Shift or Control Shift and then draw a box that goes right about through the middle of that bezel. When you click and turn to the side and hold that Shift key, you can see that the stone is sitting a little bit higher, but that's okay. Remember that we modified the size of the stone, and it's actually just a visual effect. It's not sitting as it would. Click over here on the right and then scroll to the bottom. We're missing the inside of this piece. We can't see it. Click on the button that says double, and now you can see the inside of that bezel. Let's turn the stone off though temporarily while we go in and measure. So switch to the subtool palette. Make sure the bezel is selected and turn visibility off on the stone. So this is our section or our side view of our bezel. To measure, we'll do just like we did before by switching to the move mode, turning off the gizmo, and using our transpose line. If we hover over here along this edge, it will try and snap. So click and drag out to this side. Now I'm not at the widest part of that bezel, so I could start again. So click at the top of this curve here, click and drag, hold the Shift key, and hope that it snaps on that edge, and then take a look. So what I see here is that this is about 1/2 millimeter wide, which is a little bit thick for a bezel. So if you think about it, 20 gauge wire is 0.81 millimeters wide. So this is less than 20 gauge, so it's probably somewhere in, I don't know, maybe the 22, 24 gauge thickness. We could look that up, but for now we'll just leave it. So 1/2 millimeter is the distance we've gotten. However, I might want to beef this up a little bit. If I hold down Command and Shift again and click on the background, it will bring the entire piece back. So the Select Rect literally hides part of it. I'm going to do it again. Command Shift, Control Shift, click and draw a box. So you can see here it takes a section of your piece. It's just hiding it though temporarily. To bring it back, hold down Command Shift or Control Shift and click on the background. So say we wanted to beef this up just a little bit. The easiest way to do this is to use the Deformation palette with the Inflate command. And we can just click and drag this, and you can see it's increasing in size. So that's thicker. Then I'll click and drag to a side view, hold down Command Shift or Control Shift and go right through the middle again. Bring it back. You can already see there's a difference in the thickness. I still have my transpose tool or transpose line available. So let's click on this corner and drag this out. And it's telling me that that's about 0.66, so almost 0.2 millimeters fatter. However, one last thing to keep in mind is that we need to increase the size of this because it's now too small for the stone. Again, Command Shift or Control Shift and click on the background to bring everything back. Now we just need to resize it. We'll use our transpose line to make this a measuring tool, to make our transpose line a measuring tool. We'll click somewhere on the bezel, hold the Shift key and drag all the way out, but watch at the top at your measurements. And we want to make that probably about 0.15, 0.17 is fine, something like that. Now we'll zoom in and grab the line and put that circle right around the axis in the middle. We can see the edge out here, but we'll be using the size command up in the Deformation palette to increase the size of the bezel about the middle. So click and drag, increase that size until that inside edge is right through the middle of that orange circle. And that will be increasing the size just a tad. So we've fattened it up and then increase the size. Now one last thing we can do, see it's a little faceted, so we could go back to our polish function, move that over to about a 1 and let go. And it didn't really soften it all that much. We might have stretched this a bit, so we could also re-DynaMesh. So holding the Command or the Control key, draw a box on the background and let it re-DynaMesh. And now use the polish command one more time. Just going to like say a 1 or a 2. That smoothed it out and now that looks a lot better. So that is a technique you can use for increasing the thickness and also measuring the thickness of your bezel. So I hope that's helpful and happy ZBrushing.